Ladies and gentlemen, I invite all the guests to be seated as our lecture will begin shortly. Please make sure that your handphones are in silent mode and switch it off. Thank you for your kind cooperation and attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Announcing the arrival of Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Dato Engineer Dr. Muhammad Marzuki bin Mustafa, Director of IKMAS Professor Dato Dr. Rashila Ramli, the 6th Pok Rafeah Distinguished Chair Professor Emeritus Professor Dr. Hans Dieter Evers, and VVIPs. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand up. Thank you for your kind cooperation and attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Announcing the arrival of Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Dato Dr. Rashila Ramli, please sit down. The 6th Pok IKMAS Professor Dato Dr. Rashila. Further ado, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dato Dr. Rashila Ramli, Director of Institute of Malaysia and International Studies, to deliver her welcoming address. Please welcome Professor Dato Dr. Rashila Ramli.
Thank you, Azwan. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Marzuki Muhtad, the Director of UKM Strategy, representing Professor Datuk Sri Nur Azlan Ghazali, Vice Chancellor of UKM, Honourable Excellencies, Ambassadors, Yang Berusaha Encik Muhammad Azwa Mahmud, the Chairperson of Pok Rafeah Foundation, Emeritus Professor Dr. Hans, the 6th Pok Rafeah Distinguished Chair of Professor of International Studies, guests, friends, students, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning. On behalf of the Institute of Malaysian and International Studies, I would like to welcome all of you to the 12th Pok Rafeah Public Lecture, and it will be delivered soon by Emeritus Professor Hans Dieter Evers. Ladies and gentlemen, having a lead scholar such as Emeritus Professor Hans Dieter Evers, whose heart is so deeply tied to the region and to this country, means that our institution is benefiting from the high-quality academic leadership provided by Professor Hans, more affectionately known as Pak Hans. Since his arrival in June 2016 in UKM, Professor Hans has developed and held a collegial research project in IKMAS known as Connecting Oceans, Malaysia as a Maritime Nation. More than 10 fellows and few graduate students of IKMAS and UKM from diverse disciplines are involved in the project. Since June 2016, a total of 16 workshops have been held to deliberate on perspectives and findings of this project. We are put to task in presenting our proposal that was then developed into articles for publication. The latest workshop was concluded actually yesterday afternoon. So we are still fresh from the workshop, as you can see. Now next month, on June 13-14, we will host the paper presentations for the next round of vetting as we push towards publication of an edited book on the theme of the project. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to put on record that Professor Hans goes beyond the call of duty. Pak Hans spends a lot of time with our younger scholars by teaching in our graduate courses and giving valuable feedback to our graduate students at the IKMAS Graduate Colloquium. As Director of IKMAS, I would like to personally thank Prof. Hans for helping IKMAS to develop its research program called Connecting Oceans, Interregionalism, ASEAN Integration, and the Nusantara. This program fits well with the mandate given to IKMAS to develop a social science multidisciplinary studies and new area studies. With a strong research program, we can develop good research clusters where each cluster can host a few projects. Furthermore, new groups of graduate students from 2017 are linked to different research clusters of IKMAS. In that way, we can be more focused in providing good academic training for the next generation of social science scholars and researchers. Ladies and gentlemen, IKMAS has also benefited from our close association with many ambassadors from different countries. I would like to thank especially Ambassador Michel from Germany and ambassadors from Switzerland, Sweden, Kazakhstan, as well as Iraq. In Germany and Switzerland and Sweden, we have actually strategic partners with DAAD, Goethe Institute, the World Trade Institute in Bern, as well as Stockholm University. In fact, I will be in Germany in the end of this month to visit University of Bonn as well as Frankfurt University of Applied Science, our two strategic partners there. Ladies and gentlemen, this program would not have been possible without the generous endowment made by the Pok Rafeah Foundation 20 years ago in 1996. Now, having Encik Azwa here today is indeed an honor for IKMAS and UKM, and we will be discussing further in terms of our plan for the next 10 years. After 20 years of having the Pok Rafeah program with six distinguished professors, we are looking into restructuring further in the future, for the future. Now, the 12th public lecture is also different from the past lectures because for the first time, we have included an exhibition entitled A Road to London, a visual journey, the expedition from Kuantan to London 2016. Now, some of the photographs, now this is outside, yeah? Some of the photographs are images of the One Belt, One Road, OBOR initiative, areas as proposed by China. The photos will add substantive value to the public lecture today, and they will be on display until next Friday in commemoration of UKM 47th anniversary. So we will be moving those photos down at the Chancellory. Now, my gratitude goes to Mr. Adri Hazim Abdul Rashid, the young activist, freelance photographer, for allowing IKMAS to exhibit his photos. It is even more meaningful since Adri Hazim is the great-grandson of the late Hajjah Pok Rafeah. He will be sharing his experience with us a little later. Thank you, Hazim. Last but not least, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Marzuki Muhtar to officiate the program. However, before I really conclude these short remarks, I would like to express a special word of thanks to Emeritus Professor Datuk Rahman Embong, the chair of IKMAS Research and Publication Committee, for working closely with Prof Hans to strengthen the IKMAS research program, for spearheading the Pok Rafeah Lecture Organizing Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I welcome all of you to UKM, and I know that we will have a very good session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dato Dr. Rashila Ramli. Now, allow me to invite Professor Dato Engineer Dr. Marzuki bin Mustafa, Vice Chancellor of UKM, representing the Vice Chancellor of UKM, to deliver his speech.
Thank you, MC today. Yang berbahagia, my colleague, Professor Dr. Rashila Ramli, dari IKMAS, Encik Azwa Mahmud, the Chair of Yayasan Pok Rafeah, our main speaker, our guest today, Yang berbahagia Professor Emeritus Dr. Hans or Pak Hans, Excellency Representative of Embassy. I would like also to welcome Dato' Anis, the CEO of Integrity Malaysia, Professor Dato' Rahman, who will chair the session today, and also Encik Adri Hizam, who will be sharing his experience journey later on. Distinguished guests, senior officer of UKM, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me on behalf of University Kebangsaan Malaysia to welcome all of you to this occasion, a very auspicious occasion of the 12th Pok Rafeah Chair public lectures on a very interesting and important topic on connecting ocean Malaysia as a maritime nation. I think Pak Hans, you are actually the right person to talk about this. Actually, casually, I already, Pak Hans share some of his experience, but I think I look forward to listen, from you on this official public lecture. The Pok Rafeah, as Dato' Rashila mentioned just now, actually is a endowed chair by Pok Rafeah Foundation, established with a generous grant 20 years ago. As you all know, Pok Rafeah Foundation was set up by Yang Amat Berbahagia Tun Dain Zainuddin, our former Finance Minister of Malaysia, to honor the name of his late mother, Pok Rafeah, and to promote, among others, the field of education in Malaysia. The setting up of the endowment chairs over 2 decades ago show the farsightedness of the eminent Tun Dain Zainuddin in wanting to see the continuous evolution and advancement of knowledge, particular knowledge at the cutting edge level in the field of social science for the benefit of Malaysia and the region. In the context of UKM, the Pok Rafeah Distinguished Chair Professor, established in 1996, is the second oldest chair in the university. The representative from the Pok Rafeah Foundation, Encik Azwar, who attended the ceremony today, the representative from Pok Rafeah, who came to the UKM to hand over the mock chair 20 years ago, was none other than Puan Asnida Tun Daim, the daughter of the foundation patron Tun Daim himself. Ladies and gentlemen, today at the 12th public lecture, the foundation is presented by the chairman, Encik Azwar. Allow me to express our sincere thanks on behalf of UKM to Pok Rafeah Foundation through Encik Azwar, and please convey our sincere greetings and thanks to the foundation patron Tun Daim, together with our best wishes for his continued good health. We are indeed very happy to see that the endowment has sustained for more than 2 decades today and has seen the appointment of 6 leading scholars to lead the cutting-edge research in the field of development and social transformation. The chair has brought together intellectual top leaders and raised the profile and reputation of IKMAS as a multidisciplinary social science research institute with the international standing, contributing to UKM as a leading research university. We have seen that actually IKMAS has been in consultation with Pok Rafeah Foundation on how to move the endowment to the next level in keeping with the demand of the coming decades. This move is necessary considering that the financial development demands are different today compared to 20 years. We really hope to hear good news on the result of this negotiation that Dato' Rashila is going to have with Encik Azwar. As a head of UKM Strategic Unit, we look forward to the strategic planning of our institute, Faculty Service Centre and UKM. All must have strategic partners either for research, education or specific service. I would like to warmly congratulate IKMAS for having established such connection with strong international partners. IKMAS has many, I would say, reputable strategic partners such as UNESCO, Oxford University, Nippon Foundation, World Trade Institute, and many renowned scholars from various parts of the world. At the national level, IKMAS partners include the World Bank Malaysia Knowledge Hub, the Ministry of Trade, Trade and Industry, MITI, Integrity Malaysia, Yayasan Diraja Sultan Mizan, IDFR, and IDEAS, many of which are action-oriented partners. A very special strength of IKMAS that is recognized by UKM is also its ability to engage substantially with numerous diplomatic services based in Malaysia. I know that IKMAS has 10-year strategic planning until 2020. As it moves in the next phase of the development, I hope it will enhance its capacity building in terms of human resource, finance, and facility. By doing so, IKMAS' strength in social science from multidisciplinary approach can continue to benefit the country in the long run. I would like to echo the words of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Datuk Sri Noor Azlan Ghazali. It's important that the work we do, whatever we do, is beneficial to the public. This quadruple helix approach, i.e. the synergic partnership between the academic, public sector, private sector, and community must be upheld at all times. As the National University of Malaysia, UKM is guided by our mantra, UKM, the guardian of the nation, inspiring knowledge, nurturing future. This is the responsibility that we cannot carry lightly. More importantly, as the research university and as a national university, it is the mandate of this university to be at the cutting edge of knowledge, especially knowledge that can have most direct impact on policy. I believe the lectures today by Professor Han Dieter can open up new thinking and foresight about our maritime policy and how to manage our maritime resources for the sustainable development. The project entitled Connecting Oceans, Inter-Region, ASEAN Integration, and the Nusantara under IKMAS is an example of our transnational research carried out at UKM. The potential impact of this research can have profound effect on how we can influence the discourse on South China Sea. I am proud to see that IKMAS is contributing to this regional matter by delivering outstanding work and have solid partners, especially in the Pok Rafeah Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of today's lecture is very significant for Malaysia and the region. I trust you will find today's lecture thought-provoking, and I wish IKMAS and Pak Hans success in all your undertaking. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Dato' Insinyur Dr. Muhammad Marzuki bin Mustafa. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for the moment we have all been waiting for, now I would like to hand over the floor to Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dato' Dr. Abdul Rahman Embung to moderate the public lecture.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Very good morning to everyone, to the professors, the rostrum, to Encik Azwa, to Datuk Marzuki, Prof. Rashila, to Excellency, the two distinguished guests from Singapore, Professor Mankoff and Professor. Welcome to all friends. It gives me great pleasure to be the moderator for this morning session, to introduce briefly Professor Hans Dieter Evers. I think I don't need to read out his biodata. You all can see that Professor Hans Dieter Evers is a very known Southeast Asianist who has been in the region since 1970s. First as the head of department of the sociology, the head of the Sociology National University in the University of Singapore, and then in various capacities since then and until today. So he is very well qualified to speak on the topic today, on connecting oceans, Malaysia as a maritime. Now, without further ado, I would like now welcome Professor Hans Dieter to deliver what is called in the series of Pok Rafeah as his farewell lecture, meaning the second lecture in his capacity as Pok Rafeah shareholder on the title Connecting Oceans, Malaysia as a Maritime Nation. Welcome, Prof. Hans.
Bahagia Professor Muhammad Marzuki, Pro-Chancellor of UKM, friends, academics of UK other university, most of them friends for a long time. It is always a pleasure to talk before friends rather than a hostile audience. let me, without repeating, being a world leader in the production of icebergs, big tugs. So it means that
I
innovation
would like to
can do
invite
a lot
Yang
in
Berbahagia,
developing
Professor
the
Dr.
maritime
Dr.
sector,
Ramli,
even
Director
if
of
you are
Institute
far
of
away
Malaysia
from
and
the Arctic,
International Studies,
where
to
icebreakers are
deliver
being
her
used.
welcoming address. Please
Now,
welcome Professor
Malaysia
Dr. Bachelor.
so far has no national maritime strategy. Why? Okay, let's have a look at maritime policy in Malaysia. Now, the largest shipping company, MISC in Malaysia, has given up its container services to Europe and the East. I don't know what their strategy is as a company, but the big player in the maritime sector has given up and is no longer really playing a big role in international shipping. If I may cite one of my distinguished colleagues from University Malaysia Terengganu, who said, this is Dato Sharuddin, already in 2001, he pointed out that there is no real maritime policy in Malaysia, and it's really necessary to develop such a policy. And his focus was on the multitude of institutions in the Malaysian governments that deal with maritime issues, but do not interrelate. They do not integrate their work towards a policy, towards a maritime policy. So it's not my observation, it's my colleagues in Malaysia have pointed out this dilemma a long time ago and had warned the government to do something about it. And this is another quote from a recent publication, 2011, again from Terengganu. It seems people from Terengganu are always the one who create trouble and raise difficult questions. So that's Dr. Mohammed Rosni Othman, he also noted that there is only a fragmented analysis of maritime issues and no consistent policy. So since 2000 to 2011, and I can say also up to right now, there is a maritime nation, Malaysia, without a maritime policy. So as a social scientist, of course, we like to look at the wider perspective, going back to our famous predecessors, to trying to explain the situation. The point that I want to make today is an odd one, perhaps by using the theories of civilization as put forward by Japanese Fukuzawa, by Spengler, German historian, Norbert Elias from UK, or Huntington from USA, what sort of civilizational theories they have put forward that can help us to explain why a country like Malaysia does not have a maritime policy and what could be done about it. So I feel that this is one of the tasks of a national university, to really dig deep, not being sort of locked up in day-to-day affairs as the ministries have to deal with, but also look into the background and try to come up with explanations. Why do we have this problem of a failing maritime policy? Now, another perspective I want to pursue towards the end of this lecture is the long reach of history, the longue durée of history, as put forward by French historian Brodel, which I think is well known to this audience. Now, an important aspect of this is the idea of time and space as archetypes of any civilization. So Spengler, in his famous or infamous book of The Decline of the West, said any civilization has archetypes, basic types, that define what these civilizations think about and how they handle time and space. And of course, this goes back to the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, of time and space as the preconditions of any thinking. Now, the conceptions of space, let me try to look at the conceptions of space as I see it in China and in Malaysia, or among the main population, large population, Malay. So these two pictures or photographs show a Chinese village in southern China and a Malay kampung. Now, I know what I'm talking about because I spent quite a while in a Malay kampung in Pulau Pinang when I was there, living with a Malay family, and sort of wondering about the conception of space in Malay kampungs. And the idea I got, of course, being deeply steeped, having been a kampung boy in Germany and knowing how German villages function, that in a kampung, it's very difficult to find clear-cut boundaries. This came up again when I, for some time, was working for different pejabat tanah and with UDA, trying to computerize land records. It's very difficult to find out in a kampung where actually one plot of land ends and the other one starts. Sometimes, and this I have experienced it myself, people who used to pick up a house and just transported it to another place and put it down there because well, maybe it was too wet or there was the samangat was not good. So they just put the house somewhere else, and then that plot of land suddenly belonged to another family. So there were no clear-cut boundaries. But look at the Chinese village. There are very clear-cut boundaries. There are walls between the houses. There is a clear conception of where one plot of land ends and where it starts. This was pointed out already by Paul Wheatley in a book called Pivot of the Four Quarters, where he talks about Chinese classical town planning. Now, this is a plan of the center of Beijing in 1936. Clear-cut boundaries, straight lines, all at right angles. Now, in contrast, Putrajaya right now, there are theoretically possibilities of having straight roads, but they're all curved. They are round. There is in the center, of course, the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister's residence, and various ministries, there are housing plots, but they're all scattered all over, and everything is sort of concentrated on the center with round lines, no straight, clear-cut boundaries. Now, that's a visual impression, but I think it's also an expression of a conception of space which was realized in town planning for the new capital of Malaysia. And I tried to find some documents, who the architects really were, who really called the shots, the meetings that were held to plan Putrajaya. That would be an interesting topic for anybody who still doesn't have a PhD in this room. So if you compare the plan of Beijing and Putrajaya, you see two different conceptions of space and as it is realized in town planning. So if you look at the Malay, or as I would rather call it, the Nusantara conception of space, there's always a center the Istana or the seat of power. Then there are circles around, but at the end, it's sort of fuzzy. It's not clear-cut. There's no clear boundaries. And Andaya, historian from ANU, has described this in a paper very nicely. He said, well, I'm not sure whether it was he or his wife. No. But anyway, the Andayas have pointed out that it's like the nobat, the drum that is being drummed, in the holy drum in Istana. You can hear it very clearly close by, close to the center of power, but the further away you get from the palace, the weaker the sound gets, and then it peters out. You cannot make a clear boundary. That's where the boundary is, but it's somewhere sort of in the distance it's being lost. Now, contrast this with the Chinese bounded space. There's a center also, which is the seat of power, but then there is a clear boundary. And this, of course, is visualized very much in the Great Wall of China, where the Chinese territory is clearly demarcated. There is a wall, and inside the wall is China, outside are the barbarians. Okay, so now if we accept this as a sort of civilization aspect, civilizationary aspect, different conception of space, so we can point out that the Chinese policies are probably guided by vision of territories and sovereignty. Now, this is clearly shown in the South China Sea, about which I talked last time. Building of artificial islands in the South China Sea is more or less a simulation of territory. I mean, there are some rocks and it's nothing. You just put an island and say, okay, now this is territory. And if I have territory, I have sovereignty. So that, I think, is a sort of a culturally underpinned policy that the Chinese government has been following. And this becomes very strange or very important when we look at Obor, about which I want to say a few things in greater detail, because Obor is basically in Malaysia about construction of harbors, deep sea harbors. In Kuantan, it's already going on, in Malacca. But it is always connected with condos, with big, large areas of land, which are sort of gated communities. Looks like Beijing. There's a wall around. There are guards, maybe Nepalese or whatever, but there are guards. And inside, there are condos. Why do I have to have condos to build a harbor? I was thinking, do I really need big entertainment centers, shopping malls, and big buildings, condos, in order to build a harbor? For harbor, I need warehouses, I need rail connections, I need wharves, I need places where to park the containers. But condos, I'll come to an explanation in a minute. Now this is somehow, all this is connected with a change in China's traditional passive defense strategy of defending land territory. And about 10 years ago, they said, well, okay, we now give up our along-shore defense strategy to an offshore defense. But in order to have offshore defense, they need territories. So they built artificial islands in the South China Sea, and in terms of Obor, maybe port cities elsewhere. So the concept of bounded terrestrial space was extended to maritime space, sovereignty extended to large parts of the South China Sea, and then you get this famous or infamous red dotted line where somebody in 1947 had drawn a map. Chinese government has adopted this map and says, okay, this is the boundary of China. It's a strange thing. That didn't happen anywhere in the world because the seas are governed by UNCLOS, United Nations Law of the Sea, which has been signed also by China, by Malaysia, and most other maritime nations. But here, it's simulated as if this is territory and that Chinese government has sovereignty rights, and this sovereignty rights, which you cannot really exert on sort of empty spaces of the sea, is buttressed by just putting artificial islands. Okay, now beyond the dotted line, the new Silk Road initiative that was started or announced in 2013 and is now being implemented. Now the new Silk Road, the term was actually invented by a German geographer, Ferdinand Freiherr von Richthofen, and he, and that's a nice idea, he was a professor in the University of Bonn, where I come from. So while he was a professor, appointed professor, at that time we didn't have strategy planning and all this, he was just given time off for 4 years, no teaching, nothing, during which time he wrote a 5-volume book on his investigations and travels in China. And in this book, but especially in a couple of papers, he started off with this idea of the Silk Roads, meaning the old connections of Eurasia from China to Europe, both on land as well as on the sea. So this idea has now been revitalized and is being popularized again in this new OBOR initiative, the northern and the southern Silk Roads. Well, that's how a German professor used to, from University of Bonn, used to look like. Now they look a bit different. Okay, Chinese maritime policy. Announced in September 2013, there are several social economic corridors, but the emphasis is on infrastructure development. And we all know this picture where Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib, sort of shakes hands with Xi Jinping and said, okay, we work together on this OBOR initiative. So one belt, one road, the new name was invented, and this cartoon shows how now the government moves ahead with massive financial investments. There's an investment bank, there's a Silk Road Fund, and a lot of money is poured into this. Of course, if you look a little bit, and I'm not a financial expert, but if you look into the grants that are given by these Chinese institutions, they are not free giveaways, they are loans with very good terms. Some of them, 20 years, you don't have to repay, but after 20 years, repayment is due. Now, who's going to pay for this? Your guess. Now, there has been enthusiastic endorsement from some quarters, like just from a few days ago, again, MCA President Datuk Liu said the OBOR initiative will give us a tremendous advantage in the growing global competitive market. I think he is probably right, but there are some problems involved. Now, what does OBA mean for Malaysia? I'm sure you have read about this in the press. There is the fast rail track connection from China to Malaysia and on to Singapore. Recently, the German government railway company, Deutsche Bahn, has opened direct goods trains from China to Duisburg, a town in northern Germany. So there are regular trains going. And this one is still on the drawing board, having a similar type of railway connection. Very good. Connectivity is good for the economy. And then there is the East Coast rail link from Kuantan to KL and to Malacca. The cost is quite tremendous. It used to be 30 billion US dollars. Miraculously, it has shot up to 59 billion. Whoever knows why. So that's one. And then these various OBA projects. Why Iskandar, Malaysia, for instance? It's just one of the many satellite cities that are being created. Now, if you remember the discussion on the conception of space, now if I look at these condos, they look very much like Chinese cities, and they are actually marketed in China. There are rumors that if you buy 2 condos in Shenzhen, you get a free one in Iskandar, Malaysia, as a sort of deal. So these cities are being built, and they are built mainly for Chinese nationals. Or the Malacca Gateway, 3 islands, Malacca, where we formerly used to sit by the beach and eat some fish, Portuguese fish. Now there are these big islands, one marina, as you see here, another one, again, condos, another one, maritime museum. So land reclamation is going on in Kuantan as well as in Malacca for these OBA projects. And, I keep put the otak in the kenapa itulah. Why do you have to have so entertainment areas, shopping malls, in order to foster connectivity, rail links, or harbors? I think the explanation is if you own property, you also own certain sovereignty rights. If I own a condo, even the police cannot just walk in. The police is the expression of state power. They have to get a court order first. So if I own large swathes of property, I also assume certain property rights and certain sovereignty rights in a bounded area. So I start thinking, well, maybe this is part of the conception of space. I own part of Malaysian territory, and not only that, but also in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Oman, where a Chinese state company puts up such areas with a boundary around, and within the boundaries, they don't own full property rights, they don't need it, but at least some of them is already owned and governed by a Chinese state company. Okay, I'm not criticizing this. I think from a Chinese point of view, it's a very good strategy. Now, let's follow Bordel and look into the long range of history. Now, the present 1917 OBA economies, this is a Chinese map showing in green China in the middle, and then you have the northern Silk Road countries from Russia all the way to Germany. Great Britain, by the way, because of, I guess, Brexit is already left out. And then the southern Silk Road from Malaysia all the way to India and to the Middle East, here depicted in pink. Now, remembering my old time as a student studying British history or looking into the textbook of my daughter who studies in UK, I look at a map of the British Empire around 1917, comparing 2017, 1917. Well, maybe I'm overinterpreting the geography, but the pictures look very similar. There are large areas, now if we forget especially Australia, that were British Empire, and this map looks very much like the OBOR countries nowadays. Maybe a coincidence? I don't think so. Okay, now having sort of looked at the situation in a somewhat controversial way, I think we have to be realistic and say, okay, who will benefit from OBOR? And all the chambers of commerce, all the big corporate business, there's a big advertising campaign paid for by Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. They all are very enthusiastic. They said, okay, we will greatly benefit from OBOR. I'm sure the banks will. I'm sure corporate Malaysia will. So heavy investment from wherever it comes will lead to economic growth. There's no doubt about it. So if this investment is pulled through, if the rail links from East Coast are built, there will be increased employment, there will be increased profits for local companies, maybe foreign workers will come in, but banks and corporations will reap big profits. But on the other hand, there will also be drawbacks, which are usually not mentioned. Farmers in the East Coast will lose land. In the long run, Malaysians will pay the debt. Now, if you take the East Coast Railroad, now transport experts have calculated that the passenger numbers from, say, Kuantan to KL very, very low. Most people just take a bus. They might even fly by Air Asia if they go there. I don't know. So this fast railroad, which will be expensive, will not be used a lot. So you cannot turn the traffic. So why do you have the railroad? Well, of course, you may use it to transport containers from Kuantan to the ports in, say, Malacca, or the new one, or the old one, near Kuala Lumpur, and that way you circumvent Singapore. I mean, that's why the Singaporeans' friends came to listen to my lecture. They want to know what's going on. Okay. I think there's a strategic interest behind this because Singapore is a very important power in this scheme in the shipping industry. It's also an American naval base. So by cutting across the Malay Peninsula, you cut out Singapore, just in case. So as a strategist from China, I think I would entertain this idea, just to be on the safe side. If Trump comes in and says, my friends in Singapore, please close your port to Chinese shipping, then, well, we have an alternative. We put our containers on the railroad and send it straight to Malacca. Just a deviant idea of a deviant academic. government may lose control. Now we see the situation in Cambodia, highly indebted to China. They just cannot do what they want. Otherwise, the finances will be cut and they will be bankrupt. So they have to follow Chinese policies. So there are some views that say that Malaysia's independence will be threatened. I don't say it will be lost, but there is at least an idea that it may be threatened, and the government has to think, how do I avoid this? Okay, now, is this forecasting the future of Malaysia? Is this a replay of the long durée of history? If you look at the British colonial policy, Gibraltar, Malta, Suez, Penang, Singapore, all port cities supported by a heavy influx of capital from a private government-linked company, namely the East India Company. So in the logic of capitalist expansion, okay, these countries benefited. There are a lot of people in Singapore, in Malacca, in Penang that got rich by these investments. But then these important places had to be secured. The government takes over, imperialism, so eventually these countries along these ports, cities, lose their independence or at least become dependent on an imperial power. Will history repeat itself? Now instead of from west to east, from east to west? Who knows? We don't know. It's a long durée. It's not going to happen tomorrow or day after. But at least the logic of imperialism is always there. It might not happen, but we have to think about it. So, coming from a theory of civilization, conceptions of space, maritime policy, the idea of an academic is, let's think this through, do research, find alternatives, and then the government will be empowered to act. And that's our function as academics in a national university. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pak Hans, for your thought-provoking lecture, posing tough questions for scholars, and especially for Malaysian scholars in the University Kebangsaan like us. Now we move on to the next part of the lecture, which is the Q&A. But before I open it to the floor for comments, questions, and dialogue with Professor Aras, let me just recap one or two key points that Professor Hans underlined just now. The fact that, that the region, Southeast Asia or Nusantara and Malaysia as part of the region, is surrounded by seas, has all the maritime potentials, and in the lecture there is a Maritime Achievement Index with Malaysia achieving somewhere in the middle. But despite all these potentials, that Malaysia has been a maritime nation in history and part of the Nusantara civilization, Malaysia has not developed a fully integrated maritime policy. That is the position taken by Pak Hans. And he relates that to the theory of civilization, different conceptions of space between Sinic-based civilization and Malay-based or Nusantara-based civilization. Very interesting. The conception of space, And Malaysia has been more land-based, whilst China has gone beyond along the shore to offshore kind of conception. And it's very interesting that he draws attention to the fact that our neighbor Indonesia has got a maritime program, and China, the new maritime route as part of the maritime strategy. And the final part of the lecture is the future, forecasting. Will there a repeat in the long term of what happened in imperial history of the world and in the region? Okay, I just brief recap there, and now I will open the lecture for Q&A. I invite questions or comments from members of the audience and to be directed to the speaker. Please identify yourself, your institution. I'll take one or two first, and then we get back to the speaker. Yeah, please. Yes, no? Okay.
Thank you very much, Pak Rahman, and thank you very much, Professor Avis, for a very, very interesting lecture. Actually, oh, my name, I'm sorry. I'm not too well, so I forgot so many things. I'm Rohanas. I used to be at UKM, but now I am with the National Defence University of Malaysia. I remember I've been trying sort of to promote Malaysia as a maritime nation, and in fact in 2004 I wrote a small article, but of course nobody is interested in reading it. And again in 2011 I wrote an article or a chapter in a book published by the University of Malaya, and the title of my chapter is almost similar to yours, but it's called Whither Malaysia as a Maritime Nation. And as Pak Rahman said, and I agree with him, that we have all the possibilities or the potentials of becoming a maritime nation, and yet nobody, take heed of it. So this was one of my arguments. Now, I'm very curious about your opinion as to why, despite all these possibilities, Malaysians or Malaysia does not seem to be interested in promoting the country as a maritime nation. I have one sort of lingering suspicion. I might be wrong, but I think it's partly because the Malays being, well, they were great maritime people. But I have a feeling that today, they sort of mentally, psychologically, and culturally, they do not want to connect themselves to their past, to the history, to their own history. In fact, I think some of them sort of want to repudiate, their own history and move on to something else today. So you move from Malaysia or Malaya, being a Malay, a maritime nation, and then, becoming very Anglophone, British, etc. And now today, they want to be Islamic, forgetting everything about their past, which was Malay. So I think there is no drive, no interest because of this. And the other reason, I think, you talked just now about OBO, the ability of the Chinese to project, to conceptualize, the sea as an economic, in the economic framework, which I think the Malays, unfortunately, they're not able to do that. So I just wonder why. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rohanas, for your observations and also your thoughts about why Malaysia has not pushed for an integrated maritime policy. Okay, before I ask Pak Hans to, I saw somebody from this side. Yeah, please.
Good morning. Thanks for this discussion. My name is Humam Shawi from University of UBM. I'm doing my PhD in International Relations. My question is a little far from this discussion, but it is still discussing about the maritime issue of Malaysia. Just I'd like to know the impact of Lucky's policy of India, because India is maritime doctrine determined Malaysia and some water bodies like Andaman Sea, Malacca Strait as the primary area of India's maritime area, as the maritime interest. So I want to know what's the rule of, what is the position of Malaysia and India's foreign policy. And I have another question, if you allow me. I want to know the implications of OPOR initiatives, especially in perspectives of some external powers like US and India. Thank you.
Your second question is, can you say that again?
The implications of OPOR initiative by perspectives some external powers like US and India.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we get back to the speaker now. Pak Hans, can you address those questions and observations? Thank you.
Well, we got a discussion on a good start, very, very pertinent and very difficult questions. Now, the first one by Dr. Rohana from the National Defense University. I must get your article because it would back up my paper, where I cited local scholars that have already always seen the problem and pushed the government, but somehow the government does not react. Now, the first question is really putting it in a different frameworks, posing the question, why did the Malays turn their back to the sea and look inward? What is the reason that this very important maritime history of the Malays is sort of forgotten? It's a difficult question, and I frankly don't have an answer yet. It's very difficult to understand, because it's so obvious. You have the big maritime empires. Malacca was a very important maritime empire after Sriwijaya, and plays a big role in national historiography. We have now the issues of natural resources in Malaysia, and location is perhaps the most sustainable natural resource that Malaysia has. Because being sort of in the middle and being able to connect oceans, I mean, this is the name of the project IKMAS is doing, having this position is a big asset, in terms of shipping, in terms of connections, strategic importance. Nobody can get through the Straits of Malacca without passing Malaysia, of course, also Indonesia. But it's, I don't know how many percent now of world trade goes through the Straits of Malacca. It's very essential. It's also quite difficult to understand why do we not have any figures on the contribution of the maritime economy to Malaysia's GDP. There are some estimates, we try to do this, it's something between 13 to 15%. But in the national statistics, it doesn't turn up anywhere. I mean, there's fisheries, there's shipping industries, there are various branches, but there is no account of maritime industry. And if we had this, we could sort of show how important the maritime industry is already in Malaysia, and for that, you have to have a maritime strategy. So that's a big question. the usual answer that I get, that you also indicated, is the Malays sort of turned towards Britain, became more anglicized. But that's not a good argument, because the British are very much, in sort of maritime history. There are maritime museums all over England. And there is Britannia rule the waves. This ideology is still going strong. There are movie shows about this. So the maritime history, the maritime consciousness in Britain is very strong. So when they came here, why didn't they transfer this to Malaysia? I don't know whether this was an imperialist ploy or not, but it just did not happen. So this is a big question, which I cannot answer, and which again would be a very, very nice topic for a PhD thesis. In research, we always have to be able to also account, failures. That we pose a question, we say we cannot answer it. That's not the case in business. But in research, thinking has to be open. It's always possible that we just cannot answer a question. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it puzzles me a lot, and it has puzzled me since actually 1959, when as a student I came to Malaysia at that time. Okay, the other question, the position of India on Indian maritime policy. India has changed its stand, can't remember exactly what year, but they're building up the navy. They said we have to govern the Indian Ocean and protect our ports. Very, very strong line, and it's also followed up by appropriate investments. And the Indians, from what I've read in the Hindustan Times, are very worried about Sri Lanka, because in Hambantota there's one of the Obor ports being constructed. I don't know whether anybody of you has been in Hambantota, which is a very sleepy town with a few fishing boats. But now it's a huge investment in huge harbors being constructed. So the Indians are getting worried now that at the tip of the Indian Peninsula there is now a foreign power that actually constructs, which is supposed to be a naval base. It's not just a commercial port, but it seems to be a naval base for the Chinese Navy. I don't know what their solution will be, but at least they're following the situation very, very carefully, much more carefully than, say, the Malaysian government apparently does, where these maritime issues apparently rank very low on the political agenda. Okay, that hasn't really answered all your questions, but at least this is my thinking about them.
What about the second part of the question about our views of the big powers towards Obor, US and India?
Oh, yeah. I thought I could avoid Trump. Obviously, I mean, there was a big concern because of the increased presence of the American Navy in the South China Sea. Now, Trump, we don't really know what he really wants, but now saying America first, what does it mean? Does it mean he would go even more forcefully to assert American rights in the South China Sea? Or does it mean let them fight it out and I withdraw? It's not clear. There's apparently no clear signals from the White House on this, or also not from the Foreign Service. I think in terms of political ideology, the Americans have a difficult time because the South China Sea is fairly far away from the US. And to claim some sort of rights in the faraway waters is difficult to argue. Now, the way they argue so far is mainly that the freedom of navigation as enshrined in UNCLOS has to be maintained. So they send ships through, just to make a point and say, we are allowed to go through, which is a bit of a difficult question because UNCLOS says clearly that this applies to commercial shipping. If navies pass through the 200 miles economic zone or through any territories, they have to at least announce it. So the Chinese have been trying to push the issue of having a reporting system. Before you send your navy, you have to tell us and get permission, which is maybe overdoing it, but this has been one bone of contention. But we just don't know what Trump administration is going to see. Now, looking back into history in the long term, I mean, there has always been a very strong attempt to claim the Pacific as an American territory. And this whole idea that came up, I'm not sure exactly when the term was coined, but Asia Pacific is a term that underwrites the claim of American dominance in the Pacific area. I think in the last lecture I talked about the power of words. So concepts are created and they become powerful instruments of foreign policy. So again, we don't know what the Trump administration is up to. We'll have to see.
Hans, we go for the second round of questions and comments from the participants. Anybody? Yes.
Thank you, Datuk Moderator. I'm Captain Retired Maritime, formerly with the Malaysian Navy and later Maritime Institute. Going back to the analogy raised by Professor just now on the psychology of space. You talk about drawing boundaries, and later you mentioned about that Malaysia doesn't have a national maritime policy. I think you are right. Just I want to relate the two from our experience. Whilst in the Navy, I was involved in the drafting of the National Defense Doctrine, Maritime Defense Doctrine. In fact, it was approved and it was implemented, but within ministry itself only. Why it is? Because when the thing was pushed up to the national level, I think this problem came because we don't like boundaries. So, because managing boundaries between services, agencies, ministries are very difficult. So, just to relate to the maritime security, that's why earlier on we have, before the APMM or the Maritime Agency was formed, we have a coordinating body under the Prime Minister's Department. So that coordinating body will be responsible for coordinating all maritime law enforcement. Just imagine more than 16 agencies and industries and ministries were involved in maritime law. So everybody was doing their own job, you see, without. So that's why we need a coordination. but getting a national policy approved is not forthcoming. Basically, because of the problem you said, we are always afraid of boundaries. So that was my experience. And later when I moved to the Maritime Institute, looking from the higher border, higher level basically, because Maritime Institute is under Prime Minister's Department. Again, we drafted a national maritime policy, but it goes nowhere basically. We have separate policies for port, harbor, shipping, all this, security, but none were basically evolved at the national level. So that's all my comment basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Muhammad. That is very useful input, reflecting on your experience on trying to push through a national maritime policy at the national level. I take one more before Pak Hans responds to that. Take one or two more. Anybody from any? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Arif. I'm from Maritime City of Malaysia, the former office of Captain Type, and Prof. Hanas is my professor. I'm graduate from UPNM, so I meet my professor and my senior of my workplace. I have 3 points here. First, on the concept of the maritime nation. I note that Tun Dr. Mahathir in 1997, during first International Maritime Conference, in his speech, The Making of Malaysia as a Maritime Nation, Tun Mahathir in 1997 has noted that we are a maritime nation and should progress towards one comprehensive policy between government and industry players. But then we have no subsequent action plan and the political will, then it just remain as the political level speech and not be fully implemented. And second, comment on the Malaysian maritime policy, actually we almost do have one, but now it's pending as a draft. I think it already been in third draft. It's called National Ocean Policy, or NOP. Mima was also one of the team that responsible in drafting it. The problem with NOP, it is led by National Oceanography Directorate, NOD, under MOSTI, but I feel sorry that NOP
those two inputs are very substantive.
Well, I'm very pleased that we have two comments from MIMA. MIMA, Maritime Institute of Malaysia, is a very important research outfit which holds regular conferences and has a good journal to which I contributed 2 articles, which my colleagues questioned because they said it's not Scopus listed. So that's what we do nowadays, look at Scopus. But I thought we have to put something into MIMA Bulletin because that's where the policy makers sit, and they might look into the MIMA Bulletin, but they'll never look into any Scopus journal. This is strategic planning. Okay. Now, first, Captain Mohammed, who said quite rightly, maybe we Malays don't like boundaries, which is true in many senses. And I experience it myself. If I walk through a kampung, the people just say, "Oh, silakan naik," and have some tea, and there are maybe quarrels, but they are sort of kept low. Even in an institute like IKMAS, I see that there is no strict sort of difference between the Pangara and the lecturers and the staff. They all sit in the dapur and have their tea together and so on. So I think this Malay culture is a very strong one, and it has an impact, sometimes a positive impact, sometimes also a negative impact because one maybe doesn't really like to come out with strong statements, and say, this is what I think. One likes to be sopan. Okay, so I agree with what you said about we don't like boundaries. Now, if I can put these 2 comments together, I am aware that there is a paper on national maritime policy. I haven't seen the 3rd draft, but I saw the 1st draft, which was put forward to cabinet, but was never decided upon, was never passed. So now I know that it's already the 3rd draft, but nothing really happens. And so we are still at the same stage as in 2001, when our colleague from University in Terengganu was bemoaning the situation, is that we have too many different government departments. They are not coordinated. There is no coordination between the different departments. And I would go even a step further. In order to have a national maritime policy, you have to have some sort of vision. Everybody is talking about vision and mission, like, oh, no, that's not my poster. There's a poster without a mission. How without a vision? But usually you always have mission and vision statements, that are found there. But now, what we have been discussing in our seminars and workshops, in the Pok Rafeah workshops in IKMAS, was this concept of Nusantara. And we also had some interesting inputs from our colleagues from linguistics, literature, and so on. So that is a concept which is all-encompassing, is very much focused on the sea, and which might provide a sort of a vision that goes beyond just negotiating competencies between government departments. So somebody has to come up with big ideas. I tried to find this speech by Mahathir where he talks about maritime policy, but I couldn't get a copy. There is no depository where all the speeches of the big politicians are found. if I want to find any quote from Sukarno in Indonesia, it's easy, it's all published. But in Malaysia, you don't have this. But apparently, as you said, this idea that was promoted by Mahathir at one time, that we have to have a maritime policy, was not taken up. It just petered out and was not put into action. Now, OBOR and ASEAN, I think that's an important issue, and which I didn't discuss. If I would have to give some sort of policy recommendation to balance the impact of OBOR, take up the positive impacts in terms of development and financial support, I would say, okay, the balancing could be done through stronger ASEAN integration in terms of increasing connectivity. Now, connectivity, not in the sense of having another meeting of ministers and so on, which is taking place, costs a lot of money, but connectivity in terms of sort of practical connectivity in terms of air traffic, sea traffic, and land traffic. There are some attempts in this direction, but why do we have to get the idea of railroad connections through OBOR from China? I mean, there could be ideas, and they once in a while turn up, of increasing connectivity, say, between Thailand and Malaysia to Singapore on the old rambling railroad. That's very slow and it's now improved. So there is some attempt of increasing connectivity through increased traffic. In our field, universities, there are all sorts of associations pushing for integration of ASEAN universities, but in actual fact, nothing much happens. You know, we have to admit this is maybe our problem as academics. When sort of do we go to UPM from UKM to attend their seminars or vice versa? It happens once in a while, but not really very much. If I compare that with, say, the Rhine Valley in Germany, from Bonn to Frankfurt, there are joint projects all the time. There are joint meetings. There is a joint online depository for research papers and so on. No such thing so far happens in Malaysia. I mean, that's so even in Malaysia itself, the integration between universities is not very strong. I was trying to get a sort of graduate student from MA thesis to look at the Klang Valley as a knowledge hub. There are so many universities in this area, but they don't cooperate. Why not? That's another question beyond the maritime issues. The last point, developing a national maritime policy is not only a matter of integrating government departments. That's only part of it. So far, the focus has been on this cooperation between integration of government departments, where everybody is, you use the term silos. You know, you're sitting in a silo and doesn't want to share resources and competences. That's one issue. But in addition to that, maritime policy is more than just integration of government departments. There is a maritime industry. There is the integration between manufacturing sector and port cities, the logistics of it. We have enclaves that are doing reasonably well, like in Penang, the free trade zone, but then nobody is dredging the Straits of Penang deep enough so the big container ships cannot get to Butterworth Harbor anymore. So the industry suffers because they have to send their goods on trucks to Port Klang, which is increasing costs. I mean, these are a lot of such issues that could be taken up in a comprehensive national maritime policy. And perhaps, having said this, also IKMAS should maybe cooperate more with MIMA, on this issues. MIMA is very strong in analysis of shipping, even after Nazri has left, Nazri Khalid, but still that's a strength which IKMAS doesn't have, but IKMAS is more, has more strengths in policy analysis and sort of his historical sociology and things like this, and has strong connections to Terengganu as, meaning to the border of the South China Sea. So that there are lots of possibilities of cooperation which should be taken up.
Okay, thank you, Pak Hans, for your feedback and suggestions to the future based on the, your lecture and also from the comments from the floor. I'm afraid we cannot, we have to end here in terms of participations and input from the floor because it's already 11:45. So let me just quickly wrap up and end this session before we move on to the next one. That the take-home message that I can see from the presentation today is that Malaysia badly needs and urgently needs an integrated national maritime policy, and that to move forward, based on what Pak Han said, we need a vision, a clear vision beyond just the coordination of between various ministries and agencies, but a clear vision towards taking into consideration the developments among our neighbors that have got their own plans or strategies to develop their maritime policies. On OBOR, Pak Hans stressed the importance of ASEAN integration and connectivity, air, sea, land and all that, and the need for the various universities, especially research institutes like IKMAS and MIMA, to work together to propose this, to push for the national maritime policy. Just a quick view coming up from what Professor Rohana suggested early on about, and what Professor Evers responded, why the Malays turn back to the sea and look inwards. My view is that, I mean, if we look at it very historically, it's not they chose to go inwards. They were pushed inwards by the forces, by the colonial forces from the West, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and all that, resulting in what I term as the peasantization of the Malays. And this took place over several centuries, so much so that they become disconnected with their maritime civilization. And after independence, they became so engrossed or involved in urbanization, industrialization, globalization, and so on. They became middle class, etc., etc. And now, to connect back to their history is another challenge. So, okay, that's just a very brief recap to that. And on that note, must say thank you to Professor Hans, and let's give him a round of applause. Now, may I invite our young gentleman, Saudara Adri Hazim, the great-grandson of the Hajah Pok Rafeah, to share his experiences on Kuantan London Expedition 2016, which among others crossed through the OBOR route that was mentioned in the lecture. Over to you, Hazim. Yes.
Very good morning to everybody here today, especially Professor Dr. Hans, Professor Datuk Dr. Mazuki, Professor Datuk Dr. Rashila, Professor Datuk Dr. Rahman, Excellencies, representatives of embassies, our distinguished guests, scholars, and of course my fellow students. Before we start off, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Adri Hazim, 21 years old, pursuing my degree in economics. I'm a student just like many here today. And I was invited to join the Road to London trip at the end of last year in autumn. Not as a distinguished guest or as a participant to say, but as a driver, a glorified driver. So based on my extra ability to able to take photos, that was a driving factor in me being invited to help drive some of the VIPs over the course of 45 days from Kuantan to London. So Professor Dato Dr. Rashila thought it would be a good idea to show another perspective of the Obor route. So this time is via land instead of our current focus of from the maritime perspective. So our route covered 17,800 kilometers. Slight error there, it was actually 13 or 14 countries. And it took us a total of 45 days, as I said. And here you can see our route, which started off from Kuantan. The reason for starting from Kuantan is that we were on a program to promote Pahang for Visit Pahang year 2017. We went up through Thailand, Laos, into China, where we passed through the western route of China, through Urumqi, Xinjiang province, Sichuan, into Kazakhstan, Russia, and after that through Europe. So how long did it take? First I'll answer all the normal questions that I get. So it took us 45 days. Every day we travel about 12 hours a day, and we would be driving an average of 800 kilometers. So to put that into perspective, that is the distance from Johor Bahru to Alor Kedah every day. We would be leaving at about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. So I heard that the ambassador of Kazakhstan is here? The counselor. And so we were in Astana for a few days, which we did not expect to be the second coldest capital in the world. We experienced a new low of temperature there at about minus 15 overnight, which made packing our cars quite difficult. So food, which is another question that a lot of Malaysians will ask me. Food was very limited along the journey. Passing through China, we would be away from civilization for a few days at a time. So this is how we ate. Normally, we would be having packed food along the way and eating out of the boots of our cars. Sleeping, surprisingly, throughout our whole journey, we had 4-star hotels all along the way. Although, as we have said about the very rapid development in China, we would have 4-star hotels that have been abandoned for about 10 years, and they would have maybe 20 out of 200 rooms operating. Daily prayers, also another very normal question for me to get. Because we are traveling through very diverse countries, very different from Malaysia, and we were predominantly Muslim group, we would have to do our daily prayers out in the open, usually in the compound of petrol stations, sometimes in construction sites, by the roadside, rest areas. And surprisingly, we were not met with any resistance along the way. People were mostly interested to see what we were doing. We even had a lot of Russian locals from Chechnya who joined us, surprisingly, along the way. Another question is the cars. So what cars did we take? How did we survive the journey? Due to the virtue of it being a government-sponsored program, we were in brand new cars purchased for the expedition. So it was 4x4s all the way. Although in Kazakhstan, there was a bit of surprise as we were traveling off-road for several hundred kilometers a day. And it seems in Kazakhstan, they make anything work. Another question, especially in China, which I get is, what are the toilets like? So people have been asking me whether there are doors, whether they work, whether there's water, and surprisingly in China, most of the roads we travel along, because our route was strictly restricted by the Chinese government, we would be issued a driving license and number plate which stated which stops we would be able to make, which highways we would be able to travel along, and we would be subjected to roadblocks every few hundred kilometers to ensure that we were on track. So we were not at the liberty to explore the toilet situation in China. Yeah. Although along the route we did see quite a bit of different infrastructure. This is along the Kazakh steppe, our ladies and gents toilet. So as you can see, nature. But we'll move on. So one of the most interesting things to me as a photographer, I'm not very well versed in the theory of civilization or conceptions of space. I'm very far from an academic, but I do understand people and how we interact with others, and how it is interesting to see how our cultures relate. We may be of the same religion but look completely different. We may be in the same region of Asia, but we have completely different practices. And okay, so this is an Uyghur lady in Western China. When we entered China, we thought we would be seeing Han Chinese throughout the way, but we did not expect to see Central Asians. Signboards written in Turkic instead of Mandarin. Central Asian food. We would be eating even sometimes Russian delicacies in the middle of China. We would be seeing Uyghur children, Kazakh policemen, Russian women, Han Chinese toll collectors, and it was interesting to see how similar our cultures were, although we were so far from home, days and months away from home. Another thing we saw was architecture, the culture in buildings, and how we interacted with the environment. As Professor Hans was speaking about the Chinese culture of creating boundaries around our cities, which is what we also experienced in China. Another thing we experienced was how European cities are so different from how an Asian city would function. We found it very hard to drive and park in European cities. For example, in Paris, we were forced to park 1 hour away in the Charles de Gaulle airport instead of being able to park in front of a hotel, something that Malaysians cannot understand and cannot accept. So as you can expect, the youngest drivers will have to drive an hour out at midnight to find a parking. Another thing we experienced were ancient mosques in China, ancient temples in China. We went to the Cathedral Mosque in Moscow, the red light district in Netherlands. And these were all almost overwhelming experiences for a young student and traveler like me to be exposed to such different cultures along the way. We also saw amazing disparities in infrastructure throughout our journey. Throughout ASEAN, it would be quite normal. We are quite accustomed to seeing development in ASEAN, but upon entering China, we did not experience what we had expected. We entered the Gobi Desert, and for hundreds of kilometers, we would be seeing solar farms, wind turbine farms. We would be seeing swaths of electrical pylons bringing power from western to eastern China. And we would be driving for days on end without seeing any civilization in the middle of the Gobi Desert. This is the G30 highway that passes through the Gobi Desert and was completed in 2016, in the summer of 2016. It is part of the Asian Highway Network, also part of the OBOR network, and spans 4,300 kilometers and was completed in about 3 years. We can also see the disparities in infrastructure across Central Asia, where the moment we crossed from China into Kazakhstan, we would see the difference. And from Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, in our journey to Russia, there would be no roads, showing how Kazakhstan interacts with Russia in general. And this is a toilet on the Kazakhstan steppe, a bit more introduction, toilet culture. And we were extremely shocked to see what kind of differences in our expectations and what we experience on the ground. So if I can give any message to anyone here today, be it a student or an academician or a dean, it would be to travel to these places and see what's actually happening on the ground, because a lot of the information that we are obtaining now, be it through studies or mass media, is very, very different from what we expected. We'd be traveling along superhighways in China, which we thought did not exist. We would be in 1,000-room hotels in Kazakhstan, which, I mean, before we traveled, I barely knew Kazakhstan was such a huge country. We would meet Muslim people in Russia, which honestly I did not expect. So if anybody gets the chance to take up an opportunity such as this, I mean, even to travel as a driver or photographer or special assistant, of which I was doing all of these roles throughout the journey, I would say take it, because it's truly a one-of-a-kind experience. So before I wrap up the whole experience, I'd also talk about some of the problems we had along the way. So the biggest problem was regulation. For example, this is in China, where we were not allowed into fuel stations. Passengers are not allowed to fuel stations, not allowed to use the facilities. For example, this man was filling up his motorcycle, and you are not allowed to fill up your motorcycle directly from the pump because of the racial tensions in Xinjiang province. As you know, there was a big riot a few years ago. They protect all of their strategic interests, which includes fuel stations, from rioting and preventing a large number of people from gathering in these areas. So for a very confusing safety reason, you are required to fill your fuel tanks with a kettle provided by the fuel station. Some other problems we had was based on our inexperience and ill planning before the trip. We did not expect snow or cold weather. So while parked overnight in Astana, we experienced minus 15 degrees of temperature, which froze all the diesel in our tanks. So we were stuck in Astana for an extra day and had to do a 24-hour journey the next day. We, as Malaysians, we have never experienced snow. So we were forced to change to snow tires upon arriving in Kazakhstan. We had to liaise with local Chinese workshops to do oil services, which also put in the wrong oil. We fill in the wrong fuel, which also shows the problems with Malaysians when we travel. We have we're very strong-minded. We think that people will understand everything that we want to get done. We also had some simple problems with car maintenance, but in the end, it's these small experiences that make the whole journey. So as I said before, even doesn't matter about your status, your age. I mean, on our trip, I was the youngest at 21 years old. The oldest was 77 years old. So I'm quite sure everybody here will be just as able to complete the whole experience. Definitely, Pak Han. I will be your driver if required. So after 45 days, we made it, and here I am today to tell the story. So I urge anybody who has the experience to try and do it yourself, and let me know how it went for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hazim, for that interesting, challenging, and adventurous trip that you and your team made, through the Obor route. Very insightful. Now I hand over the session to the MC. Over to you, Azwan.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Professor Dr. Abraham Ambung, for moderating the session. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, next is the exchange of gifts. I now invite Yang Berbahagia Professor Dr. Rashila Ramli to present a token of appreciation to Professor Dato Insinyur Dr. Muhammad Marzuki bin Mustafa. Yes. Next, Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Hans Dieter Evers. Mr. Adri Hazim Abdul Rashid. I would also like to invite Mr. Adri Hazim Abdul Rashid to present tokens of appreciation to Yang Berbahagia Emeritus Professor Dr. Hans Dieter Evers. Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite the VIPs to come to the front of the stage for a group photo session. Please. Thank you, all distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind cooperation. On behalf of IKMAS, I thank everyone for the support and cooperation given, without which this kind of event